Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which is take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon that I'll preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first. The second, just to allow you, the viewer, who have graciously given of your time to come by and watch these random ramblings, to allow you to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. Big thank you to my subscribers out there who tune in every week. It's always a joy to hear from you when I do. I'm grateful for you. And if this is the first time you've ever come by here, welcome, and brace yourselves. This particular Sunday is September 22nd, 2019, the 15th Sunday after Pentecost, and the end of the summer season here in the Northern Hemisphere, moving into fall. I don't know. I'm going to digress there, so I'm going to not do that. And our assigned text comes out of Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. We've been in a period where we've been having some parables of Jesus, at least for the last couple of weeks. We've got another one here, and this one is arguably one of the biggest head scratchers of Jesus' parables. Everything that I've read, every other commentator that I've listened to has all said the same thing. I often say the same thing. I have mixed feelings about preaching out of the parables, which if you've watched my videos before, you probably heard me say. This one is probably the exclamation point on me not liking parables, because it's difficult. It's the parable of the dishonest manager. And if you are familiar with it without me even reading it, you're like, oh yeah, that's a weird one. If you're not, that's okay. We'll get into it. And then we'll talk about it some. In terms of overarching narrative, where we're at, we're still in this travel narrative with Jesus having his face turned towards Jerusalem and what will happen there. In this brief, well, not brief, but in this portion, it's more aimed at teaching from Jesus. So we don't so much hear him moving around as we hear him just teaching and interacting with people. This one in particular is another period of teaching. Actually, pretty much all of chapter 16 is. There's a little bit of interaction back and forth with some of the religious elite that Jesus oftentimes tends to butt heads with. That comes up in the narrative actually right after where we cut things off today, which is unfortunate because I actually think that's kind of helpful in terms of what might be happening here. But from there, Jesus does a little tiny bit more teaching, and then he goes into another parable at the end of chapter 16. And so all of this is kind of tied in together. Basically, this one is considered to be a teaching about the distinction between serving God and serving wealth. Mammon is what it's called in the original language, but essentially wealth or riches. And then as we go into the later, kind of continue to explore what Jesus has to talk about, it really seems to be aiming at the inability of the law or following the law for us to be declared righteous. That kind of really seems to be what this is aimed at. But I've been jabbering already for a little bit, so let's go ahead and read it, and then we'll get into it as we can. And I want you to just kind of keep this in the back of your minds as we're reading it, that I kind of think that Jesus is throwing a wink here as he's telling this story. So just keep that in mind. Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you can no longer be my manager. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 50. Then he asked another, how much do you owe? And he replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and make it 80. and his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. That's the reading. Troublesome. Very, very, very troublesome. And my very first thought, and where I'm coming at this text, at least at this point, is that it almost seems like Luke is telling this out of order. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, we hear that Jesus has an interaction with someone, a debate of some sort, a teaching moment of some sort, whatever we want to call it, and they'll talk about that, or Jesus will present a teaching, and then the parable will come up. This one almost seems like it's reversed that in terms of hearing the narrative. Or hearing Jesus teaching about it. So he just starts with the parable. And it's this head-scratching parable, like, what? And then Jesus kind of starts to talk some more about it in terms of what is it that he's aiming at. Now, that being said, yes, there are also times that we hear about when Jesus tells a parable and no one seems to get it, especially the disciples. And then they're like, hey, you want to explain this? And then he will. But not always. Teachings of Jesus are kind of all over the map sometimes. But that to me, if I reverse the two sections of this overall reading, it almost kind of starts to make a little bit more sense. That Jesus is reminding us that we cannot serve two masters. Now, what does that really mean? And I heard a conversation or a commentary on this, and the language of slave and master makes us cringe just a little bit. Sorry, my phone is whistling at me because I forgot to silence it, so I'm going to lean by and do that so we don't hear it anymore. You're seeing behind the curtain for a second there. But so we have this language of slave, and particularly here in the U.S., we really kind of cringe in our seats over that. We don't like that history, and we like to brush it under the rug, so we don't even like to use the language of slavery. But it's fitting, it's on the nose, because a slave has no choice. A slave has no agency of their own, really, in terms of what goes on. Your master says something, and you have to follow it. So what does that mean? That this isn't just like, oh, I like money and I like having wealth and I like and it's a good thing. It's that you are enslaved to it, that it rules your life, and that's idolatry, when you place something else above God, and that's what Jesus is really seeming to put here. Now, with that in mind, then if we back up to the parable, maybe it kind of starts to make a little bit more sense, but it is confusing. So we've got this manager or steward who is horrible at his job. And we see little glimpses of that. Like, first of all, he doesn't even know what the debtors owe his master. Like, he calls him, hey, what do you owe again? And they tell him. Now, then there's the whole, like, lowering their debt, lowering their bill. And is he doing that because that's all they actually owed, and he was charging them more? Is this an interest type situation, and or is he cutting them some slack, or is he defrauding his master to gain some favor with these people who owe his master, so that they'll look favorably on him? I mean, that really seems to be what's going on. But he's gotten fired, and and yet he's trying to operate within the loopholes of the law, using his position as granted to him to try and improve his own situation, knowing that his situation is about to get worse. He's defrauding his master. He's potentially been defrauding the debtors. That's kind of ambiguous, but we can kind of make that assumption. And the really head scratching part of it is that when he does this, he's commended for it. He's attempting to use his own power to lighten the load of what's going to come his way. And now I heard this in another commentary, and I really kind of liked it because as I've thought about this story and just the head scratching nature and asking the question, Jesus, what are you talking about here? What are we supposed to take from this? Remember I said, I think Jesus is winking at us on this one. And it seems to me that Jesus is reminding us of this is the way the world works. This is the way that things operate when we allow law, when we allow man-made creation of law to dictate how we do things, because it will never work perfectly. It will never benefit everyone. There will always be those who are able to take advantage of the situation and benefit themselves at the expense of someone else. That will always be how this works. And it seemed to be true in Jesus' day. It seemed to be true before Jesus, because we have stuff in the Hebrew scriptures about this as well. And it's certainly still the case now today. And Jesus seems to be saying, okay, you know this. You see how the world will even applaud this because that's the way the world works? Wink. That's not how the kingdom of heaven works. And I think that's what's going on. And yet when we try and stick to this on this side, that will never get us anywhere. And maybe when we realize that we are enslaved to that, no matter how hard we try and serve that, it is never going to ultimately make us righteous. No matter how hard we try to follow the rules, we're never going to be righteous. That is when we realize that we need salvation. We need the grace of God. And now Lutheran theology, when we realize how futile our own efforts are, that is when we are susceptible, when we are open to the grace of God and to the work of the Holy Spirit, reminding us of the promise of God that no, none are righteous, and yet through Christ that we are made righteous. That is, I think, what's going on here. What's really, really happening is Jesus is like, you see how the world works? And you see how the world commends it for working that way? That's not how this works. So the harder you rely on this, and the more futile you begin to realize it is, that's when you're open and susceptible to this. And that grace of God really coming in and helping us to fully rely on it, to become the slave, to become beholden to the grace of God, and only through that is the righteousness bestowed upon us. So that's kind of what's happening here. Now I'm trying to figure out how to get a sermon out of that, but that's my work for the rest of the day. But if you have thoughts, questions, comments, throw them down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week. And as always, if you appreciate these videos and you would like to support the ministry that allows me to do them, I will put the link to my congregation's website down in the comments. You can follow the links and throw a few shekels towards the congregation that allows me to do these. No pressure to do that if you don't want to, but if you feel so led, it would be greatly appreciated. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next time.